Welcome. This is the first of 3 sessions in our series, Detoxifying Machismo, the importance of Latino fathers in prevention and recovery. My name is Dr. Pierluigi Mancini, and I am the director for the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I will be your host and moderator for this series. Before I introduce our panelists, here are some brief instructions about the event. The presentation portion of this series will be recorded and archived for future playback. It will also be dubbed or closed captioned in Spanish and in Portuguese. We will not be recording the Q&A and the conversation portion of our series in order to invite open conversation. Also, please be aware that closed captioning is available, and you must activate it by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and choosing Show Subtitle. A copy of the presentation will also be made available after the series ends. The lines will be muted throughout the presentation so as to minimize background noise and other interference. When we get to the Q&A portion of our webinar, you will have an opportunity to ask questions by clicking the Q&A box, and I will present your questions to our presenters. Or you can raise your hand and we will unmute your line so you can ask a question out loud. We will also be asking you to fill out a brief survey at the end of this series. This satisfaction evaluation is important to the work that we do and provides us the opportunity to improve our training efforts. We will remind you of this evaluation on our last session taking place on the 30th. We are proud to announce that we are now offering NADAC continuing education credits for an additional cost. Information about reciprocity with other licensing bodies and payment process will be provided after the conclusion of the series. Instructions on how to access a certificate of completion will be provided to you via email after the conclusion of the webinar and after the completion of the satisfaction evaluation. Let's start by introducing you to the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center and our team. The National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center is housed at the National Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Association, located in New Mexico. NALBA was established to fill a need for a unified national voice for Latino populations in the behavioral health arena, and to bring attention to the great disparities that exist in areas of access, utilization, practice-based research, and adequately trained personnel. The mission and goal of NALBA is to influence behavioral health policy, eliminate disparities in funding and access to services, and improve the quality of services and treatment outcomes for Latino populations. In order to meet our objective of providing national leadership on Latino behavioral health concerns, NALBA has chosen 6 major areas of focus: targeted capacity expansion of mental health services for Latinos, Latino behavioral health evidence-based practices, legislation to increase the number of counselors, therapists, and other behavioral health practitioners, funding for co-occurring disorders of alcohol and substance abuse, the opioid crisis in the Latino community, and suicide prevention. NALBA's executive director is Fred Sandoval. Our ATTC is part of the ATTC network, which is a multidisciplinary resource for professionals in the addiction treatment and recovery services field. Established in 1993 by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, the ATTC network is comprised of 10 domestic regional centers, 2 national focus area centers, and a network coordinating office. Together, the network serves the 50 US states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and the Pacific Islands of Guam, American Samoa, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and the Mariana Islands. Here you see a map of the US-based ATTCs. The National Hispanic Latino ATTC has a national focus for Hispanic and Latino communities and the workforce that provides services to these communities. Next slide. The mission of the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center is to provide high-quality training and technical assistance to improve the capacity of the workforce serving Hispanic and Latino communities in behavioral health prevention, treatment, and recovery. We disseminate and support the implementation of evidence-based and promising practices to enhance service delivery, promote the growth of a diverse, culturally competent workforce, and bridge access to quality behavioral health services. We are committed to increasing health equity and access to effective culturally and linguistically grounded approaches. Next slide. Our ATTC is staffed by me, Pierluigi Mancini, the project director. Maxine Henry serves as the project co-director, and Ruth Yanez is our executive administrative assistant. The National Latino Behavioral Health Association is also the home of our sister TTC, the National Hispanic and Latino Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We will provide information on how to contact us at the end of this session. While we will have the same three panelists throughout our series, Mr. Roberto Gursa, Mr. Juan Escobedo, and Mr. Brian Serna, they will each take turns leading the presentation and the discussion portion of the events. Let's pause here for a minute and let each one of them say a few words about themselves.
Hi, this is Roberto. Gracias, Pierluigi. Since I'll be leading the presentation, maybe I'll say a little bit about who I am as a man and as a father in a minute. And I invite Juan or Brian to say a couple of things about themselves. How about you, Juan?
Yeah, definitely. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. My name is Juan Escobedo. I'm as a program officer here in the philanthropic world. It's my current role. I'm a father of two daughters. I have a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old. I'm a son of an immigrant father and husband in a multi-generational and multicultural household. I'm the only male of 6 women in my household. Apart from that, my family history, we are a long lineage of ranchers and farmers. And currently, there's professionals in education, leadership. We got artists in the family and so on. So yeah, my father immigrated here when he was 16 years old, and being Mexicano has always been like a pride and orgullo for us. So that's how I identify myself, Mexicano Americano.
Gracias, Juan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Serna, and I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I identify myself as Chicano. And just a little bit about me as a father. I have 2 kids. My son is 18. My daughter's 15. And just I had to figure out how to be a father, basically. So my father was never around, and so Serna is actually the name of my mother's family's family, and so and that the Serna family has been in New Mexico for many generations, and I think that's enough for now. But I am a self-made father, drawing on a lot of some of the examples of healthy machismo. These are things that I had to sift through, all the stories out there and try to develop for me what it meant to be a healthy masculine man. And I feel like I've got it so far, but it changes all the time. But I'm looking forward to being on the panel, and like Juan said, it's an honor to be invited to be in this panel.
Thank you, Brian. And I am Pierluigi Mancini. I identify myself as Latino of Hispanic heritage. My father was actually Italian and my mother is Colombian, and had the privilege to live in Colombia for 13 years. I am one of 5 brothers, and we all lived in Colombia until 1976 when we came to the States. I am the father of 2 wonderful young adults. My son is 23 and my daughter is 25. And even though I had a up and down relationship with my father, the last 15, 20 years of his life, we were able to have a much better relationship. And I took some of those lessons to help me in the way that I'm able to communicate and be a part of my children's life today. So this is very, very exciting. I'm so happy you're all here. Roberto, I'm gonna let you do your introduction and then go ahead and you can jump in right into your presentation after you're done with that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Pierluigi, Brian, and Juan. I'm Roberto Gursa. I am the 5th child of 8 of immigrant Mexican parents who came here to this country in the early 1950s. My 3 eldest siblings were born in Mexico. The next 2 were born in Washington, and I'm the eldest of the Californianos born in California. I have one son who actually celebrates his birthday today. And earlier this morning when I called him to wish him a happy birthday, I talked to him a little bit about this presentation and told him, I said, hey, you know, if your ears get a little hot, it's because I'm going to talk about you a little bit since this presentation is about fatherhood. And he says, Dad, what's new? You always use me, right? And he reminded me that, you know, when he was a baby, I carried him around with me at work. When he was a boy, he often would attend, you know, executive meetings when I used to work out in California. And he says, Dad, I'm used to it. You know, you have a great time doing your presentation. Just a couple of other things that I can tell you about myself. I was born in the mid-1950s. I'm 65. I was kind of raised at a time of right in the middle of the civil rights movements, of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and had a brother who was at Berkeley in the late 1960s and spent a lot of time with him. That's kind of the crucible that helped me become who I was, what was important and valued to me. As the son of immigrant Mexican parents living in a little place that was operated under the rules of Mexico, not so much the rules of the adopted country, I also bring a lot of that with me all these years forward. So I hope that, you know, that gives you kind of just a little bit about who I am. Our intention, our hope is that across these 3 sessions, we will not only share with you some of our professional experiences, but do so grounded in who we are as people, who we are as men, who we are as fathers. We want to be sure to provide you that context so that what we have to talk about makes some sense. So I am going to share my screen and hopefully I'm going to click on the correct one. So I'm hoping, Pierluigi, can you tell me, are you seeing the correct screen, the one that says Panelists, ¿Quiénes somos?
Correct. So I am
Perfect.
seeing the right screen. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So we've talked a little bit about the quiénes somos, of who we are as people. That question is going to be at the center of the next several minutes of conversation. Quiénes somos, and we'll look at it in a number of different ways. We will look at the question of who gets to define who we are and how those definitions come to reside kind of in the public consciousness, as well as how those ideas, attitudes, notions, perceptions come to reside inside of us, as part of our internal landscape. I will repeat that. Well, actually, all of you who are participating will get this PowerPoint presentation. So if there is any reason that you want to reach out and get in touch with me in particular, you'll have that contact information. As we get started, what I want to do at first is to talk a little bit about how sometimes it can be really difficult to deal with recognizing some of our own internalized attitudes. As a Chicano, as a person of color growing up in this country, I recognize that with a lot of frequency when I'm in primarily majority spaces, majority white dominated spaces, I often approach that with a lot of caution. I am mindful about what I say about myself. I am mindful about the words that I choose. And I do a lot of editing for a lot of reasons. I am sure that all of you have a similar kind of experience. Part of the reason that we opted not to record, especially the discussion section, is that what we hope for all of us is that we can get past some of those filters, that we can struggle with and recognize that perhaps we ourselves have internalized some attitudes, some notions, some perceptions about others that may not be as accurate as we might have imagined. Ultimately, I hope to answer far fewer questions here than to pose them for you. And those questions that I hope that we walk away with are those questions that are a little difficult to contend with, to deal with, to be mindful around, and ultimately be transparent about. We hope, even in the short run of this presentation, that all of us are able to get to that place where, with some mindful sincerity and some transparency, we might be willing to talk about even some of those difficult notions that we recognize we've internalized. So kind of one question to wonder about is that these popular beliefs and attitudes, as important as it is to consider where they come from, I think it's also, of course, obviously important to consider where they go to. And I think with a lot of frequency, as human beings, we allow perceptions of the world to come in and reside inside our own internal landscape in unexamined ways. What I hope for here is that as you recognize, as we talk about a particular topic and something comes up in you and you recognize, oh man, I really believe something very different than that, that you don't resist not looking at that, that you sit with it, you try not to feel embarrassment, you resist the impulse to edit if you are intending to make a comment, to edit what it is that you actually recognize might be going on inside yourself, and instead present in a way that you hope looks better, right, than maybe what you might be struggling with. Resist that. I think it's important, right, that we all be courageous when we do this kind of work. For many of us who work, especially in the fields of diversity, of inclusiveness, we know how important it is to be courageous when we do our work outside. Oftentimes, we're maybe not quite as courageous as we might need to be when the work is internal, when we're looking at the way that we might be carrying attitudes and perceptions, that we might be stereotyping others. That courage and that tenacious interrogation itself is just as important as the way that we apply it when we're doing our work out in the outside world. So coming back to the question of quiénes somos, or who are we, let me ask you into the chat to write what comes to mind. If the question is, what describes a Latino to you? What is that? Please enter that into the chat, and Ruth and Maxine will kind of help call out some of your responses. Ruth, Maxine, are we getting responses in the chat?
Not yet, Mr. Roberto. So if you all could click on the bottom where it says chat, you're more than welcome to type your response. So do you mind repeating the question for the audience, Mr. Roberto?
Sure, that's right up in front. What comes up for you when you hear the word Latino? What describes Latino for you? What comes up? What is some of the descriptors? It can be one word, it can be a phrase.
So one of our attendees says, a Latino is a person with rich culture, emotions, and faith. Someone that identifies having Latinx heritage. Someone else says cultura, unión, familia. A very diverse population.
Good.
Forca. It's in Portuguese. Someone says cultura, pride, passion for family, hardworking, a big heart, community, familia, poder, fuerza.
Terrific. So pause for a second. And what about if the question is, what comes up for you when you hear the word Hispanic? If somebody self-identifies as being Hispanic, what terms come up for you? We're going to go through this exercise a number of times, right? What if instead of someone identifying as Hispanic, what if they use the term Hispano to self-identify? Is it different for you? Is Hispanic, does it raise in your mind a different image than what Latino suggests? Is Hispano different than what Hispanic suggests for you?
So you have responses such as Spanish speaking, Boricua, US Census construction. Honestly, I don't understand the difference. You have older generations. Someone says, I identify as Latina, Brazilian, but I don't identify as Hispanic. Another attendee said, Hispano to me sounds like an older Hispanic, and Hispanic includes European heritage. Hispanic equals Spanish speakers, Latinos equals Latinoamericanos.
How about Chicano? What comes up for you? You noticed that the three presenters, the three of us, we all self-identify as Chicanos. Well, actually, let me correct myself. If I remember correctly, Juan, you identified as Mexican-American, correct?
That is correct. I didn't come across a term until I was in college, the Chicano movement.
Okay. So Brian and I self-identify as Chicano. What comes up for all of you in the audience when you hear that word Chicano?
Some of the responses include Spanish speaking, Chicano, more American Mexican, born in America, question mark. Mexican parents and children were born in America. Mexican Americans, a blend of Mexican culture with United culture.
Now, how about you all? When you're asked to choose a cultural or ethnic label that best describes you, what term do you use? How do you self-identify? Please take a moment to pop that into the chat. Ruth, are we getting responses?
Yeah, you're getting responses such as Latina, Hispanic, Mexican-American, American, Mexicana, Latina, Mexicana. I identify as Latino, Hispanic, American, Chicano, Latina, Latina. I believe I meant to say Latina. Someone says depends on who's asking.
Oh, that's very clever. Yes, that's absolutely right. It does depend a lot on who's asking. Oh, look at, I even have it there, right? Does your choice of terms vary depending on who's asking? At least for one of us, that's the case. I know that for me, now that I'm as old as I am, I don't tend to pause much over that question. I say Chicano. I recognize that when I was younger, because Chicano is a loaded term. In fact, part of the reason that the term Chicano was chosen when the Chicano Manifesto was written, actually up in Boulder here in Colorado, it was purposefully chosen because Chicano was a slur. It had the same kind of power, negative power as the word nigger has. And purposefully, when the manifesto was being written, the choice was made, look, we're going to choose this name for ourselves. We're going to create a positive out of it, and we are going to detoxify that particular term. I have always been cautious because it's a very political term. Chicanos, by and large, when most of us who self-identify as Chicanos, there is a very strident political component to it. So it depends, not so much now in my life, but certainly in my history, about who I might say to whom I might describe myself as a Chicano. Part of this exercise, I think someone had mentioned in the responses earlier that there is a breadth, right? Even if we just look at the various different terms that we as a group use to self-identify, we recognize that we are not, when the term Latino or Hispano is used in the census, it's as if it were one homogeneous group of people. The truth is that it isn't. In front of you, you just see a very few of the range of terms that people who are broadly part of raza identify with. And you see that there are terms that describe those of us for whom a major proportion of our self-identity is tied to indigenous communities. You see terms that describe Latino Spanish-speaking peoples who are from the Caribbean islands. You see terms like Chicana and Chicano, and these are just a few. Do any of these terms, for some of you, is it the first time that you're seeing these terms? Any kind of immediate questions come up about, like, oh man, what the heck is that? What's Nicantlaca, for example? Anybody know? Nicantlaca is a term that is often used by indigenous people, especially descendants of the Mexica people, to describe that they are of the people who are from here, right? That's what that term is. People from here is what that term means. This term here, Nahuatlaca, is a term that describes people who share common roots in the language of the Mexica, which is Nahuatl. The exercise, I hope what it shows is that there is just an extraordinary diversity when we really begin to probe into the question of quiénes somos, right? It's a diversity that ranges across politics. It ranges across our costumbres, right? What music we listen to, art, and the way that we organize our families, the languages that we use, the individual and discretely different history of colonialism and impacts of conquest is very different on different people. Immigration status creates a real huge impact, right, on individual identity. issues around assimilation and acculturation and accommodation are also dispersed rather diversely, right, across all of these different terms that we've been looking at. Different groups are described in different ways around socioeconomic status indicators. Gender roles and parenting styles are diverse and heterogeneous, and differences across generation and identity and intersectional identity is also underpins this diversity across our groups. However, we're also likely to experience some similarities, right? As a group, our Latino, Chicano, Hispano, Micantlaca peoples, right, are likely to experience the impacts of marginalization in dominant culture here in the United States, likely to have similarities in experience of racism, experience disparities in healthcare, restricted access to care and services, stereotyping in the media, and kind of at a more kind of academic or service level, a lot of our models, for example, even if we're just broadly thinking about models that describe health and ill health, the dominant culture in the United States believes that those concepts of health and ill health or of disease are universals, that depression is depression, for example, that, you know, a psychotic disorder as defined in our DSM nosology really describes how that particular disease process, not only its etiology, but its impact and how it's manifested in individuals is pretty much universal. In fact, when we're trained to make diagnoses, what we're really doing is counting the presence of symptoms that are described and occur in particular clusters across particular timeframes out of this nosology, right? It's almost like there is a recipe that you look to see if all the ingredients are there, it leads you to a particular diagnosis. Many years ago, early in my career, I was working at University of California at San Francisco, and we were back at the time developing early models of cognitive behavioral treatments for depression. In particular, my interest was working with the Latino Spanish-speaking community of the Mission in San Francisco. And one of the things that I found back at the time is that while generally speaking, it is true that depression, for example, which is what we were specifically interested in, as a broad set of clusters of symptoms, those clusters we tend to see in individuals regardless of what culture or what linguistic background they come from. But how those symptoms hang together is dramatically different. I was seeing at the time, as part of our research, a woman who was the mother of a daughter. Her daughter was abducted and killed by the Green River Killer way back. This was in the late 70s. When I saw her was in the early 80s. And what was always so impressive to me about this woman was that despite her carrying one of the worst cases of depression that I've ever seen, her capacity to hope was unaffected by her disease process. Curiously, in general, when you look at white English-speaking people who are reliably diagnosed with a severe depression, what you see co-occur is the inhibition of hope in those individuals. When we looked at Latinos who were equally affected by severe depression, their capacity to hope was unmarred. That might sound like a little thing, but when you consider the question of how do we then treat individuals, well, in working with this woman, working to support, encourage, and grow her hope was an instrumental and important component of her treatment. If I was using a model for health and ill health that told me hope is extinguished, I might not even have probed that. So people of color, Latinos are often, we're like multi-shaped pegs that are slammed into the wrong hole, right? One of the other things that I hope that you walk away a little bit with is that when we think about the way in which we deliver care, that especially within mainstream systems of care, we have a huge range of evidence-based practices. Almost invariably, those practice approaches are trained to, lots of resources are given to them. And then somebody says, well, how does this work with an African-American community? How does this work with a Latino community? How does this work when we're treating Latino dads who are coming for care? Typically what happens, the model isn't changed, right? But a tail is pinned on the butt end of the model. And that tail is, oh, well, we'll modify and accommodate for when you treat Latino fathers by kind of doing this A, B, and C. But fundamentally, how we think about disease process, how we think about supporting the health process, that in and of itself doesn't change. I call that pinning the tail on the donkey.
About 15 minutes left.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have us watch a video, right? We return to the question of quiénes somos, right? Who gets to define us?
It's awesome. That makes me not invisible so much.
Yes, I'm Latina, but that's not the only thing that is about me. I don't want people to just look at me and think oh, okay, she's this and that and that. It's all these labels, right? There's more to that. There's more of me.
And I think that's the reason why I'm in education today, to sort of disprove that, despite the fact that I was undocumented, I was still, a good person.
I want to better myself, and I want to prove to my parents that everything that they went through, it's worth it at the end of the day.
I was 11 or so, and I said, Mom, are there other Mexicans who look like me? And she was a little taken aback by the question. She was like, what? She's like, of course there are. So she had me watch this movie that was made in Mexico. It's called Como Agua para Chocolate. And I still felt just more confused. I was like, Mom, Mexicans don't look like one thing. We look like everything. And she was like, yes, Kristen. And I'm like, then why do people tell me I don't look Mexican?
We're not a cookie cutter version of what, Hollywood or the media or your racist uncle projects about what we look like. And it's such a beautiful culture to belong to. I'm very proud of where I come from. And I think the term Latinx really is such a great term, because it defies the Hispanic stereotype. And it's asking people to say, look, we are so different and we are so diverse, and we're not just one specific, we're not one specific people.
Now, when someone tells me, you don't look Mexican, in a place of just equality and compassion, I say, yes, I do.
When people say things about me, good or bad, I don't take it in the heart. I just try to understand why they're saying it. I like myself.
I think it was just the point where I said, if I continue to worry about what others think of me, then nothing's going to happen with me. I'm just going to stay in this category.
I think that this is a major step, just saying on camera that, I sort of, this is who I am, and
I feel free. I feel free to be okay, this is who I am, and I hope it gives other people the inspiration to continue to do what they want to do.
When you receive the PowerPoint of this video, you will find that the links to these videos are embedded. We're not going to take the time to watch this video, but when you receive the PowerPoint subsequently, please just remember that the video links are in there. You'll be able to see this one again. ¿Quiénes somos? As a question is also answered by research. Does the name Louis Turman ring a bell for any of you? Louis Turman was a famous American psychologist. He was a tenured and emeritus professor at Stanford University. He was the president of the American Psychological Association for a long time. And what he is most known for is that he Americanized Alfred Binet's work in France around the testing of intelligence. Turman was also a prominent eugenicist. He was part of the leadership of the Human Betterment Foundation. I don't know if that rings a bell for any of you that are interested in the history of psychology, but that was an organization that was very active through the early and middle part of the 20th century. And they argued vociferously for a forced sterilization of many different groups in our society, including people of color. From Turman's rather famous book, where he first kind of described how to understand the Stanford IQ test and how to apply it, he spoke really quite clearly that superiority of people is a genetic endowment. It's an original endowment. He was clear that white people were the group, the racial group that possessed the greatest amount of that original endowment, and that other people varied substantially from that norm that was unassailably, from his perspective, evaluated as higher among white people. In an early section of his book titled The Measurement of Intelligence, when talking about two children that he tested that were the sons of immigrant migrant workers in the Santa Clara Valley, south of San Francisco, he writes, it is interesting to note that MP and CP, the initials of these children, represent the level of intelligence which is very, very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican American families of the Southwest, and also among Negroes. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they come. The fact that one meets this type with such extraordinary frequency among Indians, Mexicans, and Negro suggests quite forcibly that the whole question of racial differences and mental traits will have to be taken up anew and by experimental methods. The writer predicts that when this is done, there will be discovered enormously significant differences which cannot be wiped out by any scheme of mental culture or of experience or environment, is what he means there. Children of this group should be segregated in special classes and be given instruction which is concrete and practical. They cannot master abstractions, but they can be made to be more efficient workers, able to look out for themselves. There is no possibility at present of convincing society that they should not be allowed to reproduce, although from a eugenic point of view, they constitute a grave problem because of their unusual prolific breeding. I kind of go at some length at providing you this is because the work of Turman in my field of clinical psychology, his work is foundational to the field, right? And those attitudes and beliefs are fundamentally, inextricably embedded in just so many of the models, the theories, and the practical applications of those theories, even today, 115 years after Turman was doing this work in 1906. In the 1970s, the mid-1970s, about 10 years after President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, where the work that we did to provide mental health to communities was moved out of our state hospital systems and into community-based clinics. Well, after 10 years, there were studies all across the country that was taking a look at the question of, well, how did we do, right? Did this idea of moving us out of the hospitals and into community, did it culminate in being able to deliver mental health services to more individuals? One among many of the findings, one of the findings of the ECA study was that Latinos in particular, they were spoken about generally in the literature as Mexican Americans, excuse me, at the time. It was found that Mexican Americans dramatically underutilized mental health services provided through this new network of community-based clinics. The question became, well, hey, how come? Why is that happening? So in some corners of that research, the question was answered in this way. The argument went something like, well, you know, Mexican American people are happy, affable, amiable people who are insulated from the occurrence of mental health disease by the large families that they have around them that care for them. And so the reason that they're not coming to our clinics is because, you know, they're not affected by mental health disease in the same way that we might see in other groups. In another corner of that research, the argument was, well, Mexican Americans, by and large, are an unsophisticated people. They are fatalistic, they're humble, they accept what's in front of them. The argument continues that because the primary mode of the delivery of mental health services, especially at that time, was the talking cure, because of that humble, unsophisticated quality of Mexican Americans, they just didn't have the brain power to effectively utilize what is a sophisticated mental health tool of the talking cure. So ultimately, the utilization numbers were low because it reflected the incapacity of Mexican Americans to receive care. So there were a couple of cats at the University of Texas at Austin who said, you know what? Both of those arguments are fundamentally racist. What they did was they sought community mental health clinics across the country that were not reporting underutilization. And as you might imagine, right, what they found is among those clinics that were doing well, were seeing lots of people, were evidencing terrific positive outcomes for the people that they served. That in fact, those clinics were located in those communities. Early on, when our system of mental health centers was being ramped up, they were not placed in poor communities. They were not placed in the neighborhoods where Latinos resided. At best, they were placed in the university that required 2 or 3 bus transfers often to get to, right? In these clinics that did not report underutilization, when the Latino father would go in seeking care for their child, what he was likely to see, to be greeted by, was a Latino person at reception who could speak to him in his language, right? He was likely to find a clinic that operated in hours that allowed him, because he might be working 2 or 3 jobs, to be able to come in for care himself or to bring his children on weekends, in the evenings, and in the early mornings. Fundamentally, what this research at the University of Texas identified, right, is that it didn't have to do at all with the way the question of quiénes somos had been historically answered about Latinos. It didn't have to do with their jovial, happy-go-lucky nature that insulated them from disease, and it didn't have to do with their unsophisticated brains who really couldn't take advantage. It had to do with the way that the question, ¿quiénes somos?, had been answered by research, right? And if clinics were designed institutionally in a way that actually represented folks, spoke their language, offered care by people who understand the cultural and linguistic groundings from where they come from, then not only was disparity in utilization eliminated, but outcomes were consistently good and positive.
5 minutes, Roberto.
Okay. Jane Mercer and Ray Buriel were at the University of Riverside in the late 70s and took on a lot of this research. One thing that the research consistently indicated when looking at Mexican Americans across pretty much any index of achievement was that the immigrant population, that is the parent or parents who came from the country of origin to establish a life here in the United States, then by and large, they did very poorly on achievement. The first generation, their children, tended to achieve very highly, but as you moved out in generations, the research talked about this as a regression to the mean, right? In other words, this group performed highly for really kind of almost ununderstandable issues or reasons. That really what would have been expected is this kind of performance, and that across generations, we saw this movement back down toward the mean. When you look at this, and we continue, by the way, to see when achievement is assessed in various different studies, we tend to see this kind of function replicated. What do you think goes into this? That's a rhetorical question. When we think, though, right, of word associations that come up with, if I were to say, hey, if you hear the word un padre mexicano, what comes up for you? A Chicano pops, a Latinx dad, a Spanish father, a Nicantlacatatli. I would imagine, right, that for all of us, we form a different picture, right, of what that generates in our mind. Juan will talk more about this piece of research in his presentation next time. Olivia Sarocho of the University of Maryland, she has taken on that question, right, of trying to understand what goes into, in particular, the way that we think about, that we develop research, that we talk about Latino dads, in particular for her, Mexican American dads is what she looked at. I link, by the way, for those of you, there is an embedded link here that will take you to a seminal article by Sarocho. If I remember correctly, she wrote this in 2004, maybe. You can take a look at that detail. But in that work, she makes a number of indictments. It's a review of research, this particular paper that I'm talking about. And what she finds is that historically, traditional research, in particular about Latino dads, proceeds from a place, a fundamental starting place, defined by the researchers having cultural perceptions of their subjects that were fundamentally incompatible with the reality of their lives. She was able to identify a substantial component of stereotyping of Mexican American fathers that was operating in what she refers to as traditional research. Further, one of the other indictments that Sarocho makes is that in general, the research across the country utilized a consensus understanding of Mexican Americans and applied that to all groups, whether they were Mexican Americans or Chicanos or Puerto Ricanos or Nicantlacan, right? When you go back and take a look at this research piece, she links these particular components and approaches of traditional research to the actual research where it was found. In general, what she found, right, was that machismo fundamentally was characterized negatively. It was nearly always and consistently associated with Mexican American males and synonymous with male chauvinism. The machismo was correlated with the Mexican American father's role in the family, and that role was one of toxic masculinity, of physical prowess, and of male chauvinism. In fact, the research in describing Mexican American men would describe them as fighting roosters, right? As machos and borrachos, or drunkards, buen gallos, good fighters. Fighting roosters, pato pascual is the Spanish term for that. Mexican American men consistently, fundamentally, were described as lord and masters of their households, right? Where they perpetrated this dominant, abusive, aggressive, almost tyrannical role in the family. A macho fails to take responsibility for his family and imposes a rigid set of expectations around social and gender norms. Sarrocho also then moves to taking a look at a modern approach to investigating, to understanding, in particular, Mexican American men and Mexican American fathers. What she shows, right, is that this new contemporary approach redefines machismo and acknowledges the positive elements of machismo within the Mexican American culture. That the contemporary approach observes and validates positive qualities among Mexican American dads, such as respect and honesty and loyalty, fairness, valor, courage, generosity, and stoicism, and views those in a positive light and not always consistent with these negative conceptualizations of Mexican American men. That machismo includes, right, aside from whatever problematic components that come along and that individual men can engage in this toxic kind of way, that machismo also includes being a loving husband and partner, being a committed father, a family man, a tireless provider. So we're at one, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know how you wanted to start wrapping it up, or if you want to leave the questions that you had prepared, and then we can move on to the discussion.
Correct. So correct me if I'm wrong. We go until 1:30, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I will wrap this up in 5 minutes.
Okay.
And have 25 minutes for discussion. Does that work for you, Pierluigi?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. The National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. When I was beginning my graduate work at Berkeley, I did a small study in 1980 where I wondered, how many Chicano psychologists who teach and do research exist in United States graduate schools. If I remember correctly, the number was 9, right? There were 9 Chicano psychologists, professors of psychology who did research. That has dramatically changed. And as there is increasing diversity within our academic systems, within our service delivery systems, I think we are consistently delivering on what Sarrocho called us to do, which is to look through more culturally relevant and responsive lenses when we pose these kinds of questions, in particular about groups, people of color, right? So this is one such group, right? And they published recently a profile that describes who Latino dads are in general in the US. In general, we're an immigrant population. In general, we have on average 2.3 children. In general, the Latino father is married and cohabitating. Yes, low income, yes, has a low level of education, but is also stably employed. If you think even of these very basic demographic parameters compared to what Sarrocho describes as coming out of that traditional myopic, misinformed research, these would be inconsistent, right? We wouldn't back then, we weren't thinking about the Latino dad generally being married and cohabitating, that he was absent, right? And when he wasn't absent, he was physically abusive or drunk. Here is a recent, I put the link in here for you. This is a multi-page document that I think does a very good job at giving some basic characteristics about alcohol and alcohol consumption in the Hispanic community is how they define it. But when I was a young student, the idea was fundamental to the work with Latino men in particular, that by and large, they're all drunks. I mean, that's what my professors told me, right? Well, look, we know now, right, that Latinos are much less likely to drink than as compared to the non-Hispanic white community. Now, when Latinos drink, one of the things, if you dig into these data, there are some substantial differences and substantial areas for concern. But the more modern, more accurate, in my estimation, picture of Latino men in relation to alcohol and other drug and substance abuse and use is dramatically different than what I was taught 40 years ago. I said at the beginning, I was not going to hopefully answer a lot of questions. My hope was to have some questions be generated for you. What I do here is link for you a number of seminal documents that all come out of what Sarrocho would call a contemporary perspective on research with Latino fathers. I invite you, right, when you get this PowerPoint, dig into these, take a look and see what you think. I'm going to close on this video. If the question, one of the things that we hear all the time, right, is that Latino men out of this place of stoicism, of strength, of emotionally being all tapados, right, that we don't say, I love you to our kids. Take a look at this.
Growing up with my dad wasn't too affectionate, like,
I just want to check that's coming through for everybody, sound and video.
Yes.
Okay, terrific, thank you.
I don't think he has ever told me that he loves me, and I'm fine with that, you know?
Nunca les he dicho mucho que los quiero, pero de que los quiero, los quiero.
Growing up, even though my father never expressed verbally how much he loved me, gave me a different mindset of when I had my own kids to make sure that I did express that to them so they do know how much I love them and how much I care for them.
How would you describe your relationship with your dad?
He's kind of someone that isn't very expressive with his emotions.
Yeah, my dad is he's a very serious person. He's he doesn't like to joke around at all.
No, I don't think I've ever heard my dad say I love you.
What's up, man?
What's up? What are you doing here?
That's what's up.
Wow, you guys didn't tell me. Hey.
Who's that? ¿Estás haciendo famoso?
Sí, pues.
Dad, I have a letter for you.
A letter. All right.
Dad, growing up in a place like this is tough. We live in a place where fireworks and gunshots are just an indistinguishable noise. We can sleep through sirens and helicopters, gang members are our neighbors, and even stepping outside could be dangerous.
Pops, I wish there were enough words to express how thankful for you I am. As I continue to grow, I realize just how much of you is a part of who I am.
Papá, te quiero dar las gracias por todo tu esfuerzo y las largas horas de trabajo. Sé bien que esa lucha siempre fue pensando en tu familia.
You got through the gangs and the violence and became a stronger person and didn't stoop to the low levels of the society has created. Through all of this, you decided to have me and raise me to be better than the people around us.
I'll do something and I'll think, wow, I'm just like my dad. It was kind of annoying at first, but now I feel so lucky that we're alike. Making the decision to take on fatherhood at such a young age is one thing, but taking it on with such focus and dedication takes heart.
Quiero agradecerte por enseñarme a vivir con humildad y respeto, por aconsejarme que no hay que ser tan ambicioso, pero a la vez tener ambición y trabajar honestamente para que la familia no pase por dificultades y poder vivir bien.
I can remember you taking me to the movies when you barely had enough money. You couldn't afford to take me to Knott's or Disneyland like the other kids, but you took me to fish stores to stare at fish for hours. That became one of our best father and son activities. You showed me that even living in a place like this, you can do great things and become a great person. And that's what you're trying to show, not just me, but the community of South Central and LA. You're not only being a role model to me, but to the people of LA who can't find a lot of people to look up to around here.
No creo ser una persona ejemplar, pero creo que no andamos muy mal. Gracias a tus consejos y por guiarme por el buen camino. Mi respeto, admiración y cariño para ti.
You're done showing me what's best, so now you have to move on to the community and teach them everything you taught me by setting aside differences and helping everyone come together as a community. I love you, Dad. Thanks for everything.
Love you too, Eric. Go ahead.
I'm proud to be your son, and I'm thankful for the blessing of a father that I have. And I love you so much, Pops. Thank you, baby. I love you too. I love you.
No cabe duda que mi viejo es un viejón. Quiero mucho, papá.
I got a little emotional, like, hearing all that. I don't really hear too much positive things about me too much, but it's good to hear them. That's one of the things about being a father, like, you're never really told that you're doing a good job. You just gotta hope and pray that you are doing a good job. And I think just looking at my son, like, I'm very proud of him.
It makes you feel proud as a father because, like I said, your job as a father is to guide your children to be better people, to be better than you are.
Yo también te quiero, nomás que ha sido medio rudo para andar así.
We very frequently talk about that at the heart of so much of our work is making sure that we provide voice to the voiceless. For as important as that is, it also has to do with the ears that we use to listen to the voices that are actually talking. Latino dads, Latino fathers, Chicano dads, maybe the issue around this question of why Latino dads never say or don't say I love you doesn't have to do with their don't, but it has to do with they say it in ways that we might not be listening for. I hope that when you saw these three father-son pairs that you noticed that the expression of love, the expression of commitment, the language, both emotionally and linguistically, of how that was said was different for each one of these pairs of men. I'm going to give you some homework and hand it over to Pierluigi. I will point out, Pierluigi, that we talked about delivering 20 minutes of discussion. I'm going to deliver 18. This last bit, please see if you can go and find this film called A Better Life. It is, well, honestly, whenever I watch it, I cannot keep myself from crying throughout the whole thing. It is powerful. It's emotionally moving. It is a story about a Latino dad and his family in Los Angeles. Do see if you can make some time to find it and watch it. And across the next two seminars, maybe we can come back a little bit and talk about what you saw there, what you heard in this movie. Anyway, that's your homework. It's a fun piece of homework, even if you might cry a little bit. But I hope that you do it. So Pierluigi, here you are. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I think the audience, if we didn't have time limitations, don't want you to stop. And if you have a second, you should read some of the amazing comments in the chat. I do thank you from the bottom of my heart